It is just before dawn on August 17th, 1942. Corporal Leon Hatcher is crouched in a rubber boat, pulling at a paddle because the outboard motor has just died for the third time. The water around him has the oily sheen of a harbor at low tide, except this is not a harbor. This is the lagoon side of Butarateri, in the Makin atoll, and the black shape off his left shoulder is the USS Nautilus, a submarine he left 40 minutes ago with 211 other Marine raiders. The outboards were supposed to carry them to the reef. The outboards were soaked through in the launch, so Hatcher is paddling. He is 21 years old. He has never fired his weapon at another human being. He will, in about 9 minutes. The first tracer arcs up and over the boat at 4:43 in the morning. The second one finds the boat to his right, which is how Hatcher learns that the Japanese garrison has been awake for some time. Commander Seizo Ishikawa, who runs the atoll, has issued a standing order his men have memorized. No American will set foot on this ground and live a full day. His coastal guns were sighted in weeks earlier, each one ranged and logged against specific sectors of the reef. Machine gun nests cover every gap in the coral. When Hatcher's boat grounds on the sand, his radios are dead from the swim in. His squad is split from the main body by about 300 yards of open beach. And the weight of fire coming down on him is something none of the training films ever quite prepared him for. The raid lasts roughly 24 hours. The raiders will kill most of Ishikawa's garrison. They will also, in the confusion of a night re-embarkation through surf in the dark, leave 9 Marines behind on the beach. Those 9 men will be captured, held on Kwajalein for 2 months, and then beheaded on the orders of a vice admiral who will be hanged for it after the war. This is the opening scene. But here is what makes that scene worth opening with. Within 2 weeks of the raid, on a hillside above Pearl Harbor, staff officers were already at typewriters, and what they were producing was not condolence letters. It was not a press release. It was a document that read like a coroner's report written by an engineer. What failed, why it failed, what specifically would be changed before the next landing. One of those officers underlined a single sentence in his own draft. The outboard motor problem was foreseeable and was not foreseen. That sentence, underlined in pencil on Oahu in September of 1942, is the door into the rest of this story. Because what emerged from those early Pacific debriefs was not a weapon, and not a tactic, and not a general. It was a system, and Japan never found an answer to it. To understand where that system came from, we have to go back 23 years. In 1919, in a cramped office at the Marine Corps schools in Quantico, a brigadier general named Ben Hebard Fuller sat down with a small circle of planners and began writing something that had no business existing. The war they had just fought was in France. The assumption of every serious military thinker in the Western world was that the next war would also be in Europe, and would also be fought in trenches. The British had just tried an opposed amphibious landing at the Dardanelles against the Turks, and it had been such a famous catastrophe that the phrase opposed landing had become, in professional military writing, a kind of shorthand for suicide. Fuller and his circle wrote a document arguing that the next war would be fought across 10,000 miles of open ocean against Japan, and that it would be won or lost on exactly the kind of opposed landings every European thinker had just declared impossible. The document was called Operations Plan 712H. It predicted, with a specificity that reads today like clairvoyance, that Japan would fortify the mandated island chains of the Central Pacific as a layered defense, and that the United States would have no choice but to assault those islands one by one. It identified the specific atolls. It estimated the specific distances. It laid out in 1919 the operational geometry of a war that would not begin until December of 1941. That is not a flattering anecdote about military foresight. That is something stranger, because the document was produced by officers who had just come home from a war in which the Marine Corps had been a small auxiliary service, and who were, in writing it, arguing that their service's entire reason for existing in the next war would be something every major power had just concluded was impossible. Fuller retired quietly in the 1930s. His plan did something unusual for a staff document. It survived. It was passed from footlocker to footlocker, copied, annotated in the margins by captains who would become colonels, and colonels who would become generals. In 1935, the Fleet Marine Force adapted it into something called the Tentative Manual for Landing Operations. In 1939, the Navy adopted the manual. In 1941, the Army did. When the Allies went ashore at Salerno in 1943, the doctrine they were using had been drafted in its essentials by a brigadier general in a room at Quantico before any of the men on those beaches had been born. Which brings us back to the reef at Butaritari. Makin was a partial test. So was Tulagi, 2 weeks earlier. The real test, the one where Japan's doctrine of a decisive battle fought at the waterline would meet Fuller's framework at full weight for the first time, was still more than a year away, at a place called Betio in the Tarawa Atoll. And when it came, the bill for 2 decades of theory would finally be presented. In a single morning, the Marines would lose more men than the entire raiding force Hatcher had gone ashore with at Makin. What they did next is the rest of this story, because the men who walked off Betio did not write condolence letters either. They wrote checklists. And that word, checklist, is the verdict. It is 5 days after the atoll has fallen. The island of Betio is still smoking in places. The dead are still being counted. 1,009 Marines killed on an island smaller than Central Park, most of them in the first 6 hours. Most of them in the water before they ever reached the sand. The reef that was supposed to be covered at high tide was not covered at high tide, because an Australian hydrographer named Frank Holland had warned the planners in writing that the NAP tides in November could leave the reef exposed, and Frank Holland had been politely dismissed as an amateur. At a command post near the airstrip, Colonel Merritt Holcomb is sitting on an ammunition crate with a bandage wrapped around his left forearm. 4 feet from his boot is the concrete lip of a Japanese command bunker that is still warm from the satchel charges that cleared it the day before. Holcomb is 38 years old. He has a pencil and a notebook, and what he is writing, in the 48 hours after the worst casualty ratio the Marine Corps has ever sustained, is not an elegy. It is a checklist. The checklist has headings: preparatory shelling, what failed; tidal tables, what was ignored; amphibian tractors, what percentage made the reef; signal sets, how many were still working at H+30; dive bomber coordination, what broke down and when. Under each heading, specific findings, in the diagnostic voice of an engineer writing up the failure of a bridge. The 3 days of naval bombardment before the landing had looked, from the deck of a battleship, like the end of the world. It had looked from the Japanese bunkers 4 feet away from Holcomb's boot, like weather. The shells had been fused wrong. They had skipped off the coral-like stones. Most of the defenders had been underground the whole time, and had come up at first light to find the Marines wading toward them across a reef no one had believed would be dry. That is how the Marine Corps processed 1,100 casualties, with a checklist. And then they fixed the checklist. Here is what makes that strange. Large organizations, in the aftermath of a disaster, almost never do this. They find a person to blame. They commission a study that will not be read. They quietly rotate the officers involved and wait for the news cycle to turn over. The Marine Corps in November of 1943 did not have that option, because the next landing was already scheduled, and the officers who had survived the first one were the only people in the world who knew what had actually gone wrong. So in the 52 days between Betio and the next major landing, something happened at industrial scale that is still, even now, hard to quite believe. Amphibian tractor production at the Food Machinery Corporation plant in Lakeland, Florida, went from a trickle to a flood. The thin-skinned LVT-1, which at Betio had been shot through the hull by rifle fire, was replaced by the armored LVT-2 with a bow ramp, so that Marines could walk forward out of the tractor instead of climbing over the side under machine gun fire. Naval gunfire planning underwent what one officer, in a memorandum that survives, called a philosophical revolution. The old theory had been saturation. Throw enough shells at a square mile and something will die. The new theory was systematic target destruction. Each bunker on the target island was assigned a specific ship, a specific caliber, a specific number of rounds, and an air spotter whose job was to confirm the kill before moving on to the next one. 10 weeks after Betio, the 4th Marine Division landed on Roy Namur in the Kwajalein Atoll, against defenses comparable in density to what had killed 1,000 men on Betio. The 4th lost 290 killed. That is roughly a 70% reduction in 10 weeks. That is not a statistical quirk. That is a system learning from its own blood. What the Marine Corps had actually built in those 10 weeks and in the 10 weeks after that, and in every 10 weeks that followed, was something more important than any single weapon. It was a continuous loop, after-action review, lessons learned, distribution down to the rifle companies, doctrine revision, and then back into combat to test the revision. The loop ran on a cycle measured in weeks, and every turn of it made the next landing cheaper in Marine lives than the one before. By the middle of 1944, that loop had produced a combined arms system with 5 elements: naval gunfire from offshore, close air support from carriers, shore-based artillery once the beachhead was secure, armor, Sherman tanks landed in the first waves whenever the reef allowed, and finally the 5th element, the one that mattered most at the point of the spear: infantry assault teams equipped with flamethrowers and satchel charges, trained specifically to reduce fortified positions one at a time. That 5th element was not invented at Quantico. It was invented by corporals and privates standing in front of bunkers. Consider Sergeant Mac Holloway, 23 years old, 5 feet 5 inches tall. He had washed out of the Marines once in 1940 on a physical and had re-enlisted after Pearl Harbor when the standards bent. On the 3rd day of a landing whose name does not matter for this story, Holloway was carrying a 70-pound M2 flamethrower across about 200 yards of open sand toward a line of 6 pillboxes that had already killed the 2 rifle squads sent to flank them. He had a Browning automatic rifleman covering him. The first barman was hit in the chest at 40 yards. A second barman came up from the rear and was hit in the thigh at 60 yards. A third came up and stayed up long enough. Holloway cleared all 6 pillboxes. The official record notes that he used the flamethrower on 4 of them and a satchel charge on the other 2, because by the time he reached the 5th pillbox, he was out of fuel. Or consider Jack Lucas, 17 years old, 5 feet 8. He had lied about his age to enlist at 14, served garrison duty in Hawaii, and then when his unit was ordered to the Pacific without him, had stowed away on a transport to get to the war. On the first day of his first landing, he smothered 2 Japanese grenades with his own body to save the 3 men in his fire team. He lived. He was awarded the Medal of Honor at the age of 17 years and 200 days, the youngest Marine in the 20th century to receive it. These are not stories about heroism in the abstract. These are stories about what the 5th element looked like at the granular level, where the system met the ground. And yet, and here is where the story turns. Even as the Marines were building this loop, even as Holloway was walking toward his 4th pillbox, and Lucas was falling on his 2nd grenade, officers in a room in Tokyo were watching the same landings the Marines were watching, and they were drawing their own conclusions. When the Marines landed at Anger, and then at Peleliu in the Pelouse, in the autumn of 1944, they would meet something the 5-element system could not immediately defeat, because Japan, too, had a checklist. It is September 17th, 1944. The 1st Marine Division is going ashore on an island most of the men in the landing craft cannot find on a map. Peleliu, a coral hook about 6 miles long in the Palau Islands, roughly 500 miles east of the Philippines. The division is the old breed, veterans of Guadalcanal, the men who held the perimeter around Henderson Field in the autumn of '42 when the Marine Corps was still learning what a Pacific War looked like. They have been told by their own division commander that the fight for Peleliu will last 3 days, 4 at the outside. It will last over 2 months. It will produce the highest casualty rate of any Marine amphibious operation in the entire war. And when it is over, staff officers on General MacArthur's planning team will privately concede what they had already suspected before the landing, that Peleliu did not need to be taken at all. The airfield it was taken for was never used for anything that mattered. Here is what makes that worse. The 3-day estimate was not incompetence. The 3-day estimate was based on exactly the kind of diagnostic thinking Colonel Holcomb had pioneered on Betio 10 months earlier. The naval gunfire plan was meticulous. The LVT-2s worked. The air support was on call. The 5-element system arrived on the beach at Peleliu doing everything it had been refined to do. The landing itself, measured against Betio, was a success. The problem was that Japan had stopped defending the beach. To understand what had changed, we have to go back to a conference room in Tokyo in the spring of 1944. Imperial General Headquarters had just finished absorbing the loss of Saipan, where 50,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians had died in 3 weeks, and where the old doctrine, a decisive battle at the waterline, break the Americans in the surf, drive them back into the sea, had produced nothing but Japanese dead. The officers in that conference room concluded something they had not been willing to conclude before. They concluded that they could not stop an American landing. The five-element system, the naval gunfire, the carrier air, the Shermans in the first waves. None of it could be beaten at the beach anymore, so they stopped trying. The new doctrine had a name, Shuketsu. It translates literally as bleeding. The goal was no longer to win. The goal was to make the cost of winning so catastrophic that American public opinion would break before the Japanese home islands did. At Peleliu, the officer tasked with building the first true Shuketsu position was a colonel named Kunio Nakagawa. Nakagawa looked at the geology of his island, a spine of coral limestone shot through with natural caverns, and he saw a weapon. He and his engineers over the course of 1944 expanded the natural caves into a network of more than 500 man-made galleries. They installed iron doors. They installed counterweighted armored shutters on artillery ports, shutters that could close in under 4 seconds so that a gun could fire, retract, and be sealed behind steel before an American spotter finished keying his radio. They connected the galleries with tunnels so that a position cleared by flamethrower at 10 in the morning could be reoccupied through a hidden passage by 11. The ridge at the center of the island, called Umurbergal on the maps, became the most densely fortified square mile the Marines had ever attacked. Here is what makes the geometry of a honeycomb so difficult. In a conventional defense, you destroy a position, and the position is gone. In a honeycomb, destroying one cell does nothing to the structure. Flanking a position brings you into the fire arc of the next position, because the defenders have drawn the arcs to cover exactly that move. Pulling back brings you into the fire of a third position behind you, because the defenders have let you advance past it without firing. Waiting. The terrain itself has become the weapon, and every direction of movement is the wrong direction. Colonel Herman Hanneken's 7th Marines went into the northern spurs of the Umurbrogel on about the 8th day of the fight. Hanneken was a legend in the Corps. He had personally killed a Haitian warlord in 1919 with a service pistol in a jungle clearing, an act for which he had been given the Medal of Honor at the age of 26. He was now 47. His regiment had come ashore at roughly 3,200 effectives. 12 days later, in a report that survives in his own handwriting, he listed his regiment as reduced to fewer than 900 men capable of fighting. The 7th Marines had been, in effect, destroyed. Captain Everett Pope took C Company of the 1st Marines onto a feature the maps called Hill 100. On the night of the 5th day, he had 90 men. He had been told the hill was the key to the ridge. It was not the key to the ridge. It was a coral knob that a Japanese observer on the actual ridge, about 200 yards inland and 50 feet higher, could see the entire top of. Pope's company was hit by counterattacks through the night. Not banzai charges, because Shuketsu doctrine forbade banzai charges, but small, methodical infiltrations, 2 and 3 men at a time, from cave entrances Pope's men had not known were there. By dawn, Pope had 12 men still on their feet. He walked them off the hill himself. He received the Medal of Honor for holding it. The final American casualty figure for Peleliu was over 9,800 killed and wounded, for an airfield never used, for an island that, in the post-war assessment, should have been bypassed. This is the part of the story where the temptation is to call Peleliu a tragedy and move on. It was a tragedy. But it was also something else. It was the first appearance of a template, because Shuketsu was not a local variation. It was the new Japanese doctrine, and every island still in front of the Marines was going to use it. The officer who would perfect it was waiting on an island the Marines had not yet named in their planning documents. His name was Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. He was 53 years old. He had served as a military attaché in Washington in the 1920s, had driven across the United States in a Chevrolet, had written letters home to his wife describing the scale of American industrial capacity in terms that suggested he understood, more clearly than almost any other officer in the Imperial Army, what his country was doing when it attacked Pearl Harbor. Kuribayashi had no illusions about the outcome of the war. His stated doctrine, issued to every man under his command on the island of Iwo Jima, was plain. We cannot win. Each of you will kill 10 Americans before you die. On Iwo Jima, Kuribayashi did what Nakagawa had done at Peleliu, and then he did more. He dug 11 miles of tunnels. His command center was 75 feet underground, below the reach of any naval shell or aerial bomb in the American inventory. He installed sliding steel doors on the major galleries. He forbade banzai charges by written order on pain of court-martial. His men were to fight from the caves. They were to fall back through the tunnels. They were to make the Americans pay for every yard in a currency measured one Marine at a time. And this was the problem the five-element system now faced. The Marines had a weapon for individual positions. The flamethrower, carried by a man like Mac Holloway, could kill a pillbox. But against a tunnel network, the defenders could withdraw down the tunnel faster than an infantryman could advance across the open ground above it. By the time the flamethrower reached the cave mouth, the cave was empty. 30 minutes later, it was full again. The flamethrower had to get onto something that could carry it farther and faster and deeper into the earth than a man on foot could carry it. And that, at a training camp on the big island of Hawaii in the first week of February 1945, is exactly what a platoon sergeant named Rei Nakashima was working on. It is the first week of February 1945 at a place called Camp Tarawa on the big island of Hawaii. The camp is named after the atoll where the Marine Corps lost 1,000 men in a morning, which tells you something about how the Marines preferred to remember their own disasters. Platoon Sergeant Rei Nakashima is standing in a lava field watching his men rehearse, for the 14th time that week, a sequence of movements that did not exist in any Marine Corps manual 6 months earlier. Nakashima's platoon is experimental. It was created specifically because the Marianas Campaign, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, had demonstrated that the old rhythm was too slow. The old rhythm, the one that had worked at Roynamur and Kwajalein, went like this. Rifle squad advances. Rifle squad takes fire from a cave. Rifle squad pulls back, calls for support, waits. Support arrives, neutralizes the cave. Rifle squad advances again. Against Kurabayashi's tunnels, that rhythm would kill everyone. Because by the time the support arrived, the cave was empty. And by the time the squad advanced again, the cave was full. And the Marines would be paying for the same 50 yards of ground twice in the same afternoon. Nakashima's platoon is drilling on 3 weapons. The M2 flamethrower, the Composition C satchel charge, the 2.36-inch bazooka. They are drilling on the assumption that the next cave will not be neutralized by somebody else. It will be neutralized by them, immediately, without a pause in the advance. But the weapon that changed the equation was not a weapon a man could carry. Somewhere in a workshop in Hawaii, another team of Marines was bolting an experimental flame projector called the E-45 into the turret of an M4A3 Sherman tank, in place of the 75mm main gun. The Marines called the result the Ronson, after a cigarette lighter whose advertising slogan in 1945 was "Lights every time." The Ronson could pump a jet of thickened, burning fuel for more than 150 yards. It could deliver that jet into a cave mouth that a man on foot, carrying 70 pounds of fuel and pressurized tanks on his back, could not have approached without being killed 3 times over. And here is the thing about the Ronson that matters most. A Ronson tank alone, on an island defended by Japanese infantry with magnetic mines and pole charges, is dead within hours. The Japanese anti-tank teams had figured out at Peleliu that a Sherman without infantry cover is a large, slow, loud coffin. So the Ronson needed infantry. And the infantry needed the Ronson because the flame it could throw was the flame that actually reached the back of the cave. The Marines gave this arrangement a name. 2 names actually for the 2 halves. The blowtorch was the Ronson, the fire that drove the defenders deeper into the cave or out the back entrance. The corkscrew was the demolition and rifle team that followed behind, that killed whatever came out, and that then sealed the entrance with enough explosive to collapse the tunnel behind it. Blowtorch and corkscrew. Neither one worked without the other, and even the 2 of them together did not work without the other 3 elements of the system. Because a Ronson advancing on a cave is also a Ronson that can be killed from the next cave over. And the next cave over can only be suppressed by something else. So picture the geometry of an assault in March of 1945. 1 Ronson advances on 1 cave. An adjacent Sherman, 40 yards to the left, fires 75mm high explosive shells directly into the cave to the left of the target. A Vought F4U Corsair, directed by a ground controller lying in a shell hole 40 yards behind the tank, puts a 500-pound bomb on the cave to the right. A 105mm howitzer, firing from a position 2 miles to the rear that was cleared 3 days ago, drops suppressive fire on a 4th position up the ridge. 5 elements, on the same grid square, in the same 5 minutes. Shoketsu had no answer for that, because Shoketsu had been designed to force the Americans into a one cave at a time fight, and the Marines had stopped fighting one cave at a time. On Iwo Jima, Kuribayashi adapted. Of course he did. He was a good enough officer to adapt. His engineers began cutting cave entrances at angles, so that a jet of flame arriving at the cave mouth would deflect off an inner wall rather than reach the chamber behind it. They installed internal concrete blast doors, so that even if fire did reach the first chamber, it did not reach the second. And the Marines, within days, adapted back. Engineers began using satchel charges not to destroy caves, but to reshape their entrances. Blow the lip off, straighten the angle, so the next flamethrower's jet would carry. Shaped charges were designed in the field for specific blast door configurations that nobody at Quantico had ever seen. Here is the thing that was actually happening underneath all of it. It was not that the Marines had a better weapon. Kuribayashi's engineers were brilliant. The tunnels on Iwo Jima were, in pure engineering terms, more sophisticated than anything the Marines built the entire war. It was not that the Marines had a better tactic. Shuketsu was a superb tactic, and on a long enough timeline it would have worked. It was that the Marines were learning faster than Japan could rebuild. The loop that Colonel Holcomb had started with a pencil and a notebook on Betio in November of 1943 had not stopped running. Every landing fed the loop. Every dead Marine fed the loop. The Ronson was in the loop. Nakashima's platoon was in the loop. The sergeant who, on the 4th day of Iwo Jima, figured out that a shaped charge placed just so would punch through a particular kind of Japanese blast door. He was in the loop, and his technique would be in a mimeographed handout circulating through the 5th Marine Division before the end of the week. On April 1st, 1945, the Marines landed on Okinawa, and the beach was empty. Not lightly defended. Empty. Because General Mitsuru Ushijima, commanding the 32nd Army, had built the Shuri Line in the southern third of the island, engineered with specific knowledge of blowtorch and corkscrew, with modifications intended to defeat exactly the tactics the Marines had perfected on Iwo Jima. The Marines, going ashore unopposed, understood what the empty beach meant, and they were afraid in a way they had not been afraid since Peleliu. The Shuri Line was the most sophisticated Shuketsu position ever built. It still failed. 82 days. Nearly 7,400 American dead. More than 110,000 Japanese military dead. The Marines won because they arrived on Okinawa with 2.5 years of continuous combat experience running in a feedback loop, with a generation of non-commissioned officers who had personally seen every variation of the Shuketsu problem. With institutional knowledge that moved horizontally across the organization at the speed of a mimeograph machine. Japan's engineers were designing from theory. The Marines were adapting from memory. 3 images. And then we are done. The first is Mount Suribachi on February 23, 1945. Joe Rosenthal's photograph of 6 men raising a flag. What the photograph does not show, because Rosenthal's camera could not see through rock, is that at the moment the shutter closed, blowtorch and corkscrew teams were still clearing cave systems inside the mountain directly beneath the flagpole. The system was still running. It did not stop when the flag went up. The second is Kuribayashi's final radio transmission on March 25, 1945. He sent it from a command tunnel some distance forward of where his senior staff thought he should be. The exact circumstances of his death have never been definitively established. What is established is that the best defensive mind the Imperial Japanese Army produced in the entire war had, in his final hours, concluded that his doctrine had failed and had gone forward to die with his men. He was defeated by an institution, not by a weapon. The third is a notebook. Colonel Merritt Holcomb's notebook, the one he was writing in on the ammunition crate 4 feet from the Japanese command bunker in November of 1943. The notebook itself does not survive. What survives is the habit the notebook represents. The habit of writing down in the hours after a disaster exactly what went wrong, in the diagnostic voice of an engineer, without blame and without flinching, so that the next time the Marine Corps went ashore, the bill would be smaller. The tactic that won the Pacific was not the flamethrower. It was not the Ronson tank. It was not even blowtorch and corkscrew. It was Ben Fuller at Quantico in 1919, and the Fleet Marine Force Manual of 1935, and Leon Hatcher paddling toward the reef at Butaratari, and Holcomb on the ammunition crate. and Mac Holloway walking toward his 6th pillbox, and Ray Nakashima in a lava field, and the unnamed Marines who figured out, standing in front of a cave on Iwo Jima, that the tank and the infantryman needed each other. Build an institution that learns faster than its enemy can adapt. And then do not stop. Checklist.